Officer Brett Callaway said it so casually it could have been a weather report. Some people just don't belong here, no matter what paper says. Leaning against his locker in the Precinct 9 locker room at 6:47 in the morning, speaking to an audience of 4, laughing at a man he had never met and had already decided he understood completely. He had no idea that man was already inside the building. He had no idea that man was his new commanding officer. Stick around, because in 48 hours, every word Brett Callaway said in that locker room would be read into an official record out loud as evidence, and the man he was laughing at would be the one holding the pen. The locker room at Precinct 9 smelled the way it always did at this hour, a particular combination of industrial soap, old coffee that had been sitting on the burner since before anyone arrived, and the faint metallic tang of gear that had seen too many shifts to ever fully air out. The fluorescent light above the third row of lockers had been flickering for 11 days, and nobody had put in a maintenance request because in a place like this, discomfort was something you absorbed without complaint or you didn't last. Callaway was holding court the way he always did before the shift briefing, standing with his back against his locker and his arms loosely crossed, not because he was cold, but because it was the posture of a man who had decided long ago that every room he entered belonged to him, until someone proved otherwise, and no one at Precinct 9 had ever come close to proving otherwise. He was 44 years old, 16 years on the job, and he wore that history the way some men wear a favorite jacket, comfortable broken in, slightly too warm for the weather but impossible to take off because it had become part of how he understood himself. He was rolling his shoulders back as he talked that slow, deliberate rotation that his colleagues had long since stopped noticing, because it had become as much a part of him as his voice, which was carrying now with the particular confidence of someone who has never been interrupted mid-sentence and has stopped anticipating the possibility. His thumb ran slowly along the edge of his gold wedding band before he tapped it twice against the locker door, a habit so ingrained it had become almost rhythmic like punctuation. "Heard we're getting a transfer today," he said, and the pleasant reasonableness in his voice was the most dangerous thing about it. "Downtown sending someone over. Diversity initiative. You know how it goes." He paused for exactly the right amount of time. "Some people just don't belong here no matter what paper says. Doesn't matter where the paper comes from. Doesn't matter who signed it. This is how we do things in the 9th, and that doesn't change because someone downtown decided to feel good about themselves." Officer Dana Pruitt, stationed 2 lockers down, let out a short laugh that was slightly louder than the joke, warranted the way people laugh when they want to make sure the person speaking knows they are fully on board. She was 38, had been at the 9th for 6 years, and had learned early that the easiest way to navigate a room like this one was to stay close to the person who set its temperature. One of the younger officers near the back asked what division the transfer was coming from. Callaway's answer was immediate and genuinely indifferent. "Does it matter?" He tapped the ring against the locker again. The laughter that followed was uneven. Pruitt's came quickly and cleanly. 2 others joined at a slight delay, and at the far end of the row, Officer James Teller made a sound that could have been a laugh if you were being generous with the interpretation. A single exhale that lasted less than a second before he turned back to his locker and became very focused on the zipper of his gear bag, which had not given him any trouble in the 3 years he had owned it, but was receiving his full attention now. Teller was 51 years old and had been at the 9th for 19 of them, long enough to remember names that weren't on the roster anymore, long enough to know what the pattern looked like from a certain angle, long enough to have made the daily calculation that it was easier to look at his zipper than at the thing the zipper allowed him to avoid. He had made that calculation so many times it had stopped feeling like a choice and had started feeling like just another part of the morning, like the bad coffee and the flickering light. Callaway was still talking something about orientation procedures, something about how the unit had a culture that took time to learn, all of it delivered in the pleasant, reasonable tone of a man who believed completely in the fairness of every word he was saying. His ring tapped the locker one more time, and then the sound came from the hallway, A single set of footsteps, unhurried, each one landing with a quiet precision that was somehow audible over the ambient noise of the room, registering in the way that certain sounds register, not because they are loud, but because they carry something. And every person in that locker room felt it without being able to explain why footsteps in a hallway that heard footsteps all day long would suddenly feel like something worth paying attention to. Callaway kept talking, but his thumb had stopped moving against the ring. He appeared in the doorway without announcement, without escort, without any of the social scaffolding that people usually construct around an entrance into an unfamiliar room. No clearing of the throat, no broad smile, no preemptive apology for the interruption. He simply stopped at the threshold the way a man stops at the edge of a room he has entered 100 times before and is entering again now, and for just a fraction of a second before he stepped fully inside. His right hand moved to his left cuff and adjusted it. A small, precise motion, a straightening that was already straight. The kind of gesture that has nothing to do with the fabric and everything to do with the person wearing it. Marcus Webb was in his late 40s, and the years sat on him the way years sit on men who have spent them doing difficult things with deliberate care, not heavily, not dramatically, but with a permanence that was visible in the set of his jaw, and the particular quality of his stillness, the way he occupied space without appearing to take up any more of it than he needed. He was carrying a worn leather folder under his left arm, nothing else, and his uniform was pressed with the kind of attention that suggested it was not the first time he had pressed it, and would not be the last. He scanned the room, not quickly, not nervously, the way someone reads a page they already know, checking that nothing has moved since they last looked. His eyes moved from face to face without lingering cataloging, without judgment, the way a man confirms a map he drew from memory and finds it accurate. The room had gone briefly quiet when he appeared, that involuntary pause that happens when something enters a space that doesn't match the pattern the space has established for itself. And then Callaway recovered, which took him less than 2 seconds because recovery was something he was very good at, and he turned slightly toward Marcus with an expression that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and dismissive, the particular combination that skilled social architects deploy when they want to establish a hierarchy while appearing to extend a courtesy. "You lost," Callaway said, and there was a lightness in his voice that made the question sound almost friendly, almost concerned, like he was genuinely trying to help a man who had wandered into the wrong room, which was, of course, precisely the point. He turned back to the others as he said it, barely completing the rotation toward Marcus before beginning the rotation away, as if the answer were already known and the follow-through was simply courtesy. A small sound came from Pruitt's direction, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. Marcus let the question sit in the air for a moment, not because he was searching for an answer, but because he was finishing his scan of the room, his eyes completing their circuit before arriving briefly at Callaway, then moving to the locker numbers above the row nearest the door. "Looking for the sergeant's office," he said. His voice was even unhurried, carrying neither explanation nor apology, just the clean transmission of a factual statement. "Could you point me toward it?" "Sure thing," Callaway said, gesturing with the easy generosity of a man who has just been given the opportunity to be helpful, which in this context meant the opportunity to demonstrate that he was the person others came to for direction. He pointed toward the corridor to the left, added a brief description of the turn delivered with the particular warmth of someone explaining something simple to someone who requires simplicity. Pruitt's mouth curved slightly. "Thank you, Officer Callaway," Marcus said. The room didn't register it immediately. The words were ordinary. The tone was ordinary. The entire exchange had been ordinary. Right up until the moment, it wasn't until the name landed and sat there in the space between them and Callaway's expression went through a small, involuntary recalibration that lasted less than a second, but was visible to anyone paying close enough attention. He had not introduced himself. His name was on his badge, which Marcus had read while scanning the room, and Marcus had simply used it the way you use the name of someone you already know, without ceremony, without explanation, as though it had always been available, and there had never been any question of whether to use it. Callaway's shoulders did a slow, almost imperceptible roll backward. "Sure," he said, and his voice had the same tone as before, but something beneath the tone had shifted very slightly the way the pitch of a room changes when a window opens, and you can't quite tell where the draft is coming from. Marcus nodded, once turned, and walked out of the locker room with the same measured pace he had entered, with each step the same as the last, unhurried, as though the hallway ahead of him were already exactly what he expected it to be. Teller watched him go. He stood at his locker with his gear bag in his hand, and he watched the doorway for 2 full seconds after Marcus had disappeared through it, and something moved across his face that was not quite concern and not quite recognition, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both the particular expression of a man whose instincts are telling him something his experience hasn't fully formulated yet. He turned back to his locker. The zipper gave him no trouble. The briefing room at Precinct 9 was the kind of space that had been functional for so long it had stopped trying to be anything else. Rows of metal chairs arranged with the uneven precision of habit rather than intention. A whiteboard at the front that bore the ghost marks of 100 previous briefings imperfectly erased, and a command board on the east wall that outlined the unit structure in columns of names and ranks and responsibilities updated monthly by whoever had drawn the short straw that week. Sergeant Lou Grady ran the morning briefing the way he had run it for 7 years, competently, without inspiration, with the particular efficiency of a man who had long since internalized the difference between what a briefing was supposed to accomplish and what it actually accomplished, and had made his peace with the gap. He was 55, heavy-set, with the kind of face that suggested he had once possessed a considerable tolerance for conflict and had spent the intervening years quietly depleting it. Marcus came in 2 minutes before the briefing started, took a seat in the back row without announcing himself, and opened the leather folder on his knee. Nobody introduced him. Grady's eyes passed over him when he entered, held for a fraction of a second longer than the other faces in the room, then moved on, and that fraction of a second was the only indication that Grady knew something the room didn't know yet and had made the decision for reasons of his own not to share it. The briefing proceeded through its familiar rhythms: active cases, patrol assignments, administrative reminders that everyone had heard before in slightly different configurations. Marcus listened without interrupting, his hands resting loosely on the folder in his lap, his eyes moving occasionally to the command board on the wall with the same quality of attention he gave everything in the room, complete and apparently effortless. Near the end of the assignments, Callaway leaned slightly toward Pruitt and said something in a voice low enough that most of the room couldn't catch it, but the acoustics near the back were kinder than the room's architects had probably intended, and the words arrived at Marcus's position with enough clarity to be understood. "Give him the Riverside files that'll keep him busy and out of our way." Pruitt's lips moved in a response that didn't travel as far. A moment later, Grady announced the final assignment of the briefing. The Riverside Cold Files, a stack of paperwork that represented 18 months of accumulated cases in various states of incompletion, needed review and organization. Marcus received the assignment the way he had received the others, without expression, without response beyond a single nod of acknowledgement. The stack was placed on the chair beside him at the end of the briefing. Heavy, slightly disorganized, the kind of assignment that communicates its message without needing to be decoded. He set his leather folder on top of it, opened the first Riverside file, and began reading. 2 rows ahead, Simone Carver gathered her own materials and prepared to leave. She was 34, the only other black officer in the unit, and she had been at Precinct 9 long enough to understand exactly what the Riverside assignment was and what it was meant to accomplish. She had received similar assignments herself in her early months, not the same files, but the same message delivered in the same language of apparent normalcy. She understood the dialect fluently. What she didn't understand, watching the new officer in the back row read his first Riverside file with the focused attention of someone who found it genuinely interesting, was why he looked like a man who had exactly what he came for. She filed the observation away and walked out of the briefing room with the others. Marcus was among the last to leave. He tucked the Riverside stack under one arm and moved toward the door, but he stopped for a moment at the command board on the east wall, the one with the columns of names and ranks and responsibilities. He read it from top to bottom with the unhurried thoroughness he gave everything, and somewhere in the middle of the reading, His eyes paused on the top line, the commanding officer position listed with a name that was not his own, a name that belonged to a man who had retired 4 weeks ago and whose replacement had not yet been officially announced to the unit. His eyes stayed on that line for 4 seconds. Not long, not dramatic. The kind of pause that a person makes when reading something they already know and are simply confirming, and then he walked out of the room. Teller, who had been the last person behind him, watched the 4 seconds happen and felt the unease in his chest sharpen slightly into something he still couldn't name. Something that felt less like suspicion and more like the particular discomfort of a man who is beginning to suspect that the story he has been telling himself about a situation is missing a chapter. He walked out after Marcus and said nothing to anyone, which was, he was realizing something he had become very practiced at. By 9:30, the precinct had settled into its mid-morning rhythm, and Marcus had established himself at a side desk in the records-adjacent workspace where the overflow work was traditionally sent a table that received exactly as much natural light as it deserved, which was none illuminated instead by a single overhead fixture that buzzed at a frequency designed to make concentration slightly more effortful than it needed to be. He worked through his Riverside files with the unhurried precision of someone for whom this kind of work was not a burden, but a practice. His hands moving through the pages in a consistent pattern read, "Assess flag or clear set aside with a color-coded system of adhesive tabs that nobody at Precinct 9 used, because nobody had apparently thought to use its small rectangles of yellow and blue and red appearing along the edges of the stack at a rate that suggested he was not skimming." Callaway passed through the workspace at 10:15, hands in his pockets, moving with the loose, purposeful walk of a man who has somewhere to be that isn't quite urgent enough to require any adjustment in pace. He glanced at Marcus, then at the files, then back at Marcus, and said in the tone of someone offering helpful orientation, "Records room is down the hall on the left if you need anything pulled. You'll probably be on that stack a while." He kept walking before Marcus could respond, which meant the response, if it came, would be directed at a departing back, which was the intended structure of the comment. Marcus said, "Thank you," to the departing back evenly and without irony, and went back to the files. The second pass came at 11:40 this time, with a more specific request. The dispatch logs from a case in the Riverside stack were needed for a report Callaway was writing. Could Marcus locate them? It was the kind of request that was technically reasonable and practically designed to interrupt, and Marcus found the logs in approximately 90 seconds, extracted them without disturbing the surrounding organization, and handed them across without comment. Callaway took them, noted the speed without acknowledging it, and walked away. But he held the logs in his hand for a moment after turning, not reading them, just holding them, and something in his posture suggested he was doing a small private calculation. It was what happened at 12:40 that was different from the others. Callaway came back through the workspace this time with Grady, which changed the geometry of the moment, and he stopped at the side desk and said in the reasonable, collegial tone of a senior officer doing an orientation check, "You know I've been talking to the sergeant here, and we want to make sure you get off on the right foot. This unit has a specific culture, a specific way of doing things, and not everyone from outside adjusts." He paused. "There's no shame in recognizing early on that a different posting might be a better fit. We've had transfers before who made that call and were better off for it." Grady stood slightly to the side, not speaking, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Marcus's left shoulder, with the careful vacancy of a man who has agreed to be present for something and is managing his participation by minimizing it. Marcus looked at Callaway for a long moment. The workspace was quiet. 2 other officers were visible through the doorway to the main bullpen, and the angle of their positions suggested they could see the exchange without being close enough to hear it. Callaway had chosen the location with the awareness of someone who has done this before, visible enough to establish the social fact of it, private enough to avoid a record. The specific phrase "a different posting might be a better fit" was not something Marcus had expected to hear used so directly, and the using of it was. He understood immediately both a threat and an instruction delivered with the breezy confidence of a man for whom this particular script had always worked, who had said these words, or close enough to these words, to 3 or 4 people before, and had watched them eventually pick up their things and leave, and who had no framework for the possibility that the person in front of him had not come here to stay, but had come here to finish something. He said, "I appreciate you checking in, Officer Callaway." His voice was even and unhurried, and gave away nothing of what was underneath it, which was a cold, precise, thorough fury of the kind that does not express itself in the moment, because it has already found its proper expression in the work. "I'm comfortable with my assignment." Callaway looked at him for a beat. Then he rolled his shoulders back, tapped his ring once against the edge of the desk, and said, "Suit yourself." He walked away, and Grady followed without looking at Marcus, and the workspace went quiet again, and Marcus sat with the specific weight of that exchange for exactly the amount of time it required, and then set it aside and went back to the files. He flagged 3 more pages before lunch. His hands did not shake. At 12:15, Simone Carver pulled a chair to the opposite side of the table. She didn't announce herself, didn't offer conversation, just sat across from him the way you sit across from someone in a library when the mutual understanding is that the silence will be respected. She ate for perhaps 2 minutes before she said, without looking up from her food, "The timestamps on the Caro filing are wrong." It was not a question. It was a test. "I know," Marcus said. "And the case number cross-reference on the supplemental report doesn't match the primary." He paused. "Have you seen that pattern before, files with cross-references that don't hold?" Simone put her fork down and looked at him directly, the recalibrating look of someone revising a first impression they had thought was settled. "Which cases?" she said. "Cases from the last 18 months where a civilian complaint was attached to the initial report, but doesn't appear in the forward documentation." He said it as straightforwardly as he might read an address from a map. "There are 4 of them so far." There was a pause, and in that pause Simone made a decision that felt, in the moment, less like a risk, and more like the relief of something that had been held too long finally being set down. "There are 7, she said. Marcus didn't write anything down. He looked at her steadily in the way of someone receiving a piece of information they will not forget, and then asked very quietly, "Is there a pattern in who filed the supplemental reports?" "Same badge number," she said. "Every time." He nodded once, the small definitive nod of someone for whom a thing has been confirmed rather than discovered, and turned back to his file. Across the room, Callaway watched the table where Marcus was sitting, his ring tapping a slow rhythm against his own desk, his shoulders rolling backward once in the way they did when something wasn't sitting right, and he hadn't yet identified what it was. By 2 in the afternoon, Marcus had worked his way through 63 of the Riverside files, and the picture they were assembling quietly across the surface of the side desk with its inadequate light was not the picture of administrative backlog that the assignment had been designed to suggest. It was something else, something that had been carefully constructed to look like nothing. 3 of the closed cases had arrest reports with internally inconsistent details, the kind of inconsistencies that are easy to miss in isolation and impossible to ignore in sequence, where a suspect's described location in a narrative report doesn't match the coordinates in the dispatch log, where a timeline in one document is contradicted by a timestamp in the attached evidence submission form. Individually, each discrepancy could be attributed to the ordinary imprecision of paperwork generated under pressure. Together, read against each other with the particular attention Marcus was giving them, they had the quality of a signature, the specific fingerprint of someone who had done this many times and had become comfortable with the assumption that nobody would ever read everything at once. 2 of the files contained civilian complaint forms, one from a business owner on Riverside Avenue, one from a woman who had been a passenger in a vehicle searched without consent that had been attached to the initial reports, and then somewhere between the initial filing and the forward documentation had disappeared, not destroyed. The precinct's filing protocol used sequentially numbered attachment forms, and the gaps in the numbering sequence showed where something had been removed rather than never added. The complaints were gone. The holes where they had been were still there, visible to anyone who knew to look at the numbers. And across all 5 of the files that bore these marks, the name of the filing officer was the same. Badge number 9441. Callaway. Marcus photographed each relevant page with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything the phone held flat, the frame steady. He worked through the stack without changing his pace or his posture, without giving any indication to the room around him that the files in front of him were anything other than what they appeared to be. He had been told to expect exactly this. He replayed the conversation in his mind the way you replay a thing you've committed to memory precisely because you knew you would need it later. Deputy Chief Helen Marsh across a desk in a downtown office that smelled of old files and strong coffee. 2 weeks before this morning, speaking with the careful precision of someone who has spent 14 months assembling a case from fragments and is finally close enough to the complete picture that the remaining distance feels both exciting and dangerous. 4 officers in 18 months, she had said without any particular emphasis, the way you say a number that has already done its emotional work on you and now requires only its clinical delivery. All voluntary transfers. All cited cultural fit issues in their exit documentation, which is the language people use when they can't prove the specific thing that happened to them. Internal Affairs opened a preliminary inquiry. It went nowhere because every document they needed had been through Callaway's hands at some point, and there was nothing provably wrong with any single document on its own. She had looked at Marcus with the directness of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right tool, and is not going to be sentimental about using it. He dismisses people before he understands them. That's not an accident, that's a method. What I need is someone he will dismiss so completely that it never occurs to him to be careful. Marcus had understood immediately, not with any flash of insight, but with the quiet recognition of someone who has spent enough time in enough rooms to know when the apparent surface and the actual structure are 2 different things. He closed the last file in the stack, aligned it neatly on top of the others, pressed the color-coded tabs flat against the pages, and carried the entire reorganized collection back to the intake shelf where it had been taken from. He left it in perfect order. He left no indication that it had been anything other than routine work, completed by a new officer on his first assignment. He returned to the side desk and opened his personal encrypted device, his own connecting to a server that existed entirely outside the precinct's infrastructure, and began to write. Not a complaint or a memo, but a narrative, clear, sequential, factual, the kind of document that turns fragments into a complete picture by placing them in the correct order and allowing them to speak for themselves. He wrote for 40 minutes, cited specific file numbers and page references and badge number patterns, and when he was done, he read it once, corrected 2 word choices, and sent it to a secure email address with a subject line that contained 4 words. Ready when you are. He closed the device, put it in his jacket pocket, and went to get a cup of the coffee that had been sitting on the break room burner since before anyone arrived. It tasted exactly as bad as he expected, and he drank it anyway, standing at the window that looked out at the parking lot, thinking about nothing in particular for approximately 3 minutes, which was the amount of time he had allocated to thinking about nothing in particular, and then he went back to work. The business owner on Riverside Avenue, who had filed a complaint that disappeared, she had followed up twice before concluding that the system didn't work for people like her, and stopping. The woman who had been a passenger in the unlawfully searched vehicle, her complaint had never been officially received as far as the forward documentation was concerned, which meant as far as the institution was concerned, it had never existed. 3 of the 4 departed officers had cited in their exit interviews variations on the same language of feeling that they weren't wanted, that the culture wasn't something they could work within, that it seemed easier to leave. The 4th had said nothing in their exit interview, which was its own kind of statement. Marcus had not come here to read these files and move on. He had come here because these files were the record of what had been done to real people, and real people deserved a real accounting. The call came in at 3:47, a situation at a corner store on Alderman Street that had started as a noise complaint and had evolved through the specific alchemy of a warm afternoon and accumulated grievances into a standoff between two families that had been arguing about a property line for 6 years and had chosen today to make it loud and physical and public. Two of Callaway's team were out, one on a court appearance that had run long. One who had called in with something she described as a stomach thing that everyone understood to be a Friday-adjacent ailment, and Callaway standing at the assignment board with the satisfaction of a man who has just identified a perfect use for an available resource, turned to the room and said that the new transfer could take it. Routine de-escalation. Good way to get familiar with the neighborhood. His voice had the brisk, generous quality of someone doing a colleague a favor, and the officers within earshot received it as exactly that, because they were practiced at receiving things the way Callaway intended them to be received. Pruitt's expression did something small and pleased. Teller looked at the assignment board, then at Callaway, then at the board again with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the result of. Marcus looked up from his desk when Callaway addressed him. Not defensively, not with the alertness of someone anticipating an ambush, just the ordinary attention of someone hearing their assignment, and said, "Is there backup available?" "Should be straightforward," Callaway said with the confidence of someone who has already decided what the outcome of a situation is going to be. "Single unit call." Marcus considered this for approximately 1 second, then turned to where Simone was standing near the filing cabinet. "Officer Carver, are you available for backup on this one?" Simone looked at him. Then she looked at Callaway, whose expression had done something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite displeasure, but occupied territory adjacent to both. "Yes," she said, before the social mechanics of the room could organize themselves into an objection. "Let me get my jacket." Callaway said nothing. His ring tapped once against the edge of a nearby desk, brief, involuntary, quickly suppressed. The store on Alderman Street was exactly what the dispatch description had suggested. 7 people, 2 families, a property marker, a rusted iron pin in the sidewalk that nobody disputed the existence of, but everyone disputed the meaning of, and a store owner named Gerald Park who was caught in the middle and had called dispatch primarily to establish a record that he had tried to address the situation through official channels. Marcus parked the unit at the curb, walked to the center of the argument, and said nothing for the first 30 seconds. He just stood there, not in the way of the gesturing, just in the space where someone standing quietly becomes the most interesting thing in the room by virtue of not moving. The volume came down incrementally the way temperature comes down when a window opens gradually, then a bit faster, then all at once. He spoke to each family member individually and in sequence, asking simple questions that required specific answers, converting the argument from performance, which requires an audience, and loses energy when the audience stops reacting, into conversation, which has its own internal logic that tends toward conclusion. He did not take sides. He did not offer opinions on property lines. He redirected 3 times when voices started to rise each time with the same quiet redirecting question, the same unhurried tone. 11 minutes after arriving, Gerald Park was able to close the front door of his store. The Marchettis were heading north. The Delgados were heading south. Nobody had been arrested. Nobody had been pushed. Simone stood beside the unit and watched the whole thing with the focused attention of a person who has seen a lot of de-escalation attempts and is watching one being done correctly, which is a rarer experience than people outside the profession might imagine. On the drive back, she said, "Where did you work before this?" He told her 2 cities, 2 different departments, 14 years in one and 8 in the other. The specific assignments kept brief because the specificity wasn't the point of the question, and they both knew it. She looked out the passenger window. "You don't talk like a transfer," she said. He didn't answer that directly. He drove. Back at the precinct, Marcus wrote the incident report in exactly the time it should take, neither rushed nor prolonged, and filed it with the clean completeness of someone who is aware that what you put in writing becomes eventually the only version of events that matters. Community impact noted. Follow-up recommended. Contributing factors documented without editorializing. Callaway picked up the report from the intake tray, read it without expression, set it back down. He read it again. He set it down again with the careful control of someone who has decided that their face should not be doing anything interesting right now. He walked back to his desk and sat down and tapped his ring against the edge of the keyboard before stopping. The report was flawless. There was absolutely nothing in it that he could use. End of shift came at 5:15, and the locker room reassembled itself from its scattered parts. The officers who had been in the field returning in ones and twos, the space reconstituting itself in the lower, more worn key of people who have used themselves up in the particular way that work uses people up, and are now doing the necessary business of becoming civilians again. Callaway was there first, which was not unusual. Being there first was a way of owning the room from its opening, establishing the atmosphere before anyone else had the chance to offer a competing one. He had his locker open and his jacket off, and he was talking before the second person had fully entered. The day's reconstruction came quickly and fluently, the way a story comes fluently when its teller has been composing it internally for some time and is now simply releasing the composed version into the air. The Riverside assignment had been designed to occupy a new officer that was the characterization he offered, delivered with the self-assurance of a man explaining his own chess move. The new transfer had finished it quickly, which Callaway described as beginner's luck, the particular luck of someone who doesn't know enough to understand what they're missing. "Beginner's luck runs out," he said, shoulders rolling back in the familiar way. He tapped the bench twice with his ring. "Give it a week." Then he straightened and his voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted what he was saying to sound like wisdom rather than preference. "Look, this job isn't about paperwork. It's about knowing who belongs on which side of the badge. I've been making that call for 16 years, and I've been right 16 years running. Nobody downtown gets to tell me I called it wrong. Some people just don't get it. This is how we do things in the 9th. You either understand that or you don't, and no paper from downtown changes what the job actually is." Pruitt said something confirmatory. One of the younger officers looked at the floor. Teller was not in the room. He had arranged to leave 30 minutes early, a favor from Grady unexplained in the request and unquestioned in the granting, and his absence was not remarked upon because Teller's quiet was such a consistent feature of the room's atmosphere that its presence and its absence were equally unremarkable. He had not been present to provide the 1-second half laugh that usually indicated the minimum required participation in these moments, and the gap where it would have been went unfilled and unnoticed. Pruitt was louder than usual in the space his absence created her agreement with Callaway, carrying an energy that slightly exceeded the moment's requirements. The way a person fills silence with volume when the silence makes them uncomfortable in ways they don't have language for. What none of them knew was that Marcus Webb had passed the locker room on his way to the parking lot at 5:08, when the door had been standing open at a 40-degree angle to allow the room to breathe after a full day, and in the particular acoustics of that corridor at that hour, with the hallway quiet, and the room populated, the words had traveled with remarkable clarity. "This job isn't about paperwork. It's about knowing who belongs on which side of the badge. Nobody downtown gets to tell me I called it wrong." Marcus had heard it the way you hear a thing you have already accounted for with the particular non-surprise of confirmation, the quiet recognition of a detail arriving exactly where it was expected. He had not slowed down. He had not changed his expression. He had continued through the corridor with the same measured pace, his left cuff perfectly straight, his leather folder under his arm, and he had pushed through the exterior door into the early evening air without looking back. Inside the locker room, Callaway was finishing his reconstruction, wrapping it in the familiar language of institutional certainty, the comfortable vocabulary of a man who has been the authority on how things work in the 9th for so long that the possibility of that authority having an expiration date had never required serious consideration. He tapped his ring against the bench one last time, the sound ringing briefly in the metal and tile space. "Week," he said again with finality. "Give it a week." In the parking lot, Marcus unlocked his car, a dark blue sedan, several years old, maintained, with the same attention he gave everything, and put the leather folder on the passenger seat. He sat for a moment before starting the engine, both hands on the wheel, looking at the front of Precinct 9, the way you look at a building you have studied, and now know from the inside the way the inside and outside of a place start to correspond once you understand the relationship between them. Then he started the car and drove home, and the parking lot went quiet, and the lights of Precinct 9 stayed on the way they stayed on every night, steady, indifferent, entirely unaware that something had already changed inside them that could not be changed back. The parking lot at 612 was mostly empty. The day shift gone, the evening shift already inside the space between them belonging to no one, owned by the flat yellow light of the security fixture above the third row of spaces, and the particular quiet that institutional buildings have when they are populated, but not busy. Marcus was standing beside his car, with the door open, his jacket over his arm, making no particular rush of leaving. Simone came through the exterior door with her bag on one shoulder and saw him before he gave any indication he saw her, and she made the decision to say something. A small decision, she registered as significant because she had learned over 2 years at the 9th to treat all small decisions involving new people as significant, since the small ones were the ones that accumulated into something you either regretted or didn't. 3 promotion reviews, she said, stopping a few feet from his car, not as preamble, but as evidence delivered directly the way you speak to a person who you have decided can receive a thing without it needing to be decorated. She was not complaining. She was offering the record. Marcus said nothing for a moment, looking at her in the way of someone who is genuinely interested in the complete picture before they ask the first question. Then, walk me through the first one. She did. 26 months ago, the review had been scheduled, then delayed, once then a second time with different administrative reasons given for each delay, and then it had quietly ceased to be scheduled at all. And when she had asked Grady about it, he had told her she needed more time in her current role to demonstrate leadership readiness. And when she had asked what specific areas she needed to develop, he had said he would follow up and had not followed up. The second 14 months ago, a review that proceeded to the formal evaluation stage where the evaluating officer Callaway, sitting on the promotion board as the unit's senior officer, had cited leadership readiness concerns in the written assessment with no supporting documentation, no specific incidents referenced, no observable metric that corresponded to the concern expressed. The review board had deferred to the unit assessment. The promotion had not been approved. The third 4 months ago. Grady had told her the sergeant slot had been filled by someone from another unit. She had checked. It had not been filled. The slot had simply gone unfilled, and the explanation had been offered and accepted, and nothing had happened. She told him all of this in the even tone of someone who has already done their own grieving about a situation and is now in the phase of simply carrying the facts, not performing composure. Genuinely composed the way people become genuinely composed about things that have hurt them, long enough for the hurt to become structural rather than acute. Marcus listened without interruption, without expression, with the particular quality of attention that communicates to a speaker that what they are saying is being fully received, that nothing is being edited or minimized at the point of entry. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Keep your head down for 48 hours. He said. She looked at him. The parking lot light did something uncharitable to both their faces, but in that light she could see that his expression was not the expression of someone offering reassurance. It was the expression of someone giving an instruction based on a specific understanding of a specific situation. She was intelligent enough to understand the distinction and experienced enough in the management of her own survival to know when to ask the follow-up question and when the follow-up question would only consume time better spent on the instruction itself. "Okay," she said. He nodded once. She walked to her car. He sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel, not starting the engine, and his right hand moved to his left cuff and straightened it against the steering wheel. The private version of the gesture, the one that was not for any room or any audience, the one that was simply his. The small ritual of a man collecting himself before the next thing. He held it there for a moment, the cuff perfectly flat, and then he picked up his phone. Marsh answered on the second ring. He said, "Pattern confirmed. Documentation in progress. I need 48 hours. A brief silence, not hesitation, just the silence of someone receiving information they have been waiting for and taking a moment to register that the waiting is almost over. "You have them," Marsh said. He ended the call, put the phone in his jacket pocket, and started the car. He sat for another moment, looking at the front of Precinct 9, the lit windows, the flag above the entrance moving in a small evening wind. And then he pulled out of the parking lot and drove into the early dark, and the space where his car had been went still, and the night shift was already inside, and nobody was watching, and nothing visible had happened, and everything had. Marcus arrived at 6:30, which was an hour before the locker room would start filling, and 45 minutes before Grady usually came in, and he used the empty precinct the way he used most things, with intention, moving through the corridors with the quiet purposefulness of someone doing reconnaissance in a place they already know, but want to confirm from the inside. He reviewed the intake log from the previous night, checked the open caseboard, made one note in the small personal notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, and then at 6:51 knocked on the door of Sergeant Grady's office. Grady arrived at 6:53, 9 minutes earlier than his usual time, which suggested that something about yesterday had adjusted his morning schedule in ways he hadn't articulated even to himself, and found Marcus already standing in the hallway outside his door, with the particular patience of someone who has been waiting without minding the waiting. "Morning," Grady said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has woken up with a feeling he can't name and is managing it through the application of routine. "Morning," Marcus said. "Do you have 5 minutes?" Inside the office, with the door closed and the morning quiet sitting around them like a held breath, Marcus asked a single question, precise, minimal, exactly large enough for the purpose, and no larger about a specific date in the Riverside filing queue 14 months ago when a civilian complaint had been attached to a forward documentation packet and had not arrived in the Internal Review Office despite the intake stamp indicating it had been received and queued for processing. He cited the file number. He cited the intake stamp date. He cited the specific gap in the attachment sequence that indicated where the complaint had been before it stopped being anywhere. Grady went pale. It was not the pallor of a man who has been accused. Marcus had accused him of nothing. It was the pallor of a man who has been asked a question so specific that it can only have come from someone who has read everything, someone for whom the blurred peripheral shape that Grady had been looking away from for 14 months had suddenly become perfectly unavoidably clear. "Who are you?" Grady said. The words came out quieter than he intended. Less a challenge than a genuine question, the sound of a man who has been standing in a room for a long time and has just noticed that the floor is a different material than he thought. "I'm the officer you assigned the Riverside files to yesterday," Marcus said. The simplicity of it landed in the room and sat there, and Grady looked at him for a long moment with an expression that moved through several stages. Recognition calculation, the specific deflation of a man whose internal argument for inaction has just lost its last coherent point, and then looked at the files on his desk. The papers that represented the ordinary administration of a unit he had been managing for 7 years in the particular way of someone who has learned that the easiest form of management is the management of his own discomfort. Marcus thanked him for his time. Quietly, genuinely, the way you thank a person who has given you something useful without knowing they were doing it, and left the office. In the hallway he walked back toward the main floor with the same unhurried pace as always, and behind him, through the closed door of Grady's office, there was a silence that had a different quality from ordinary silence, the quality of a man sitting alone with the specific weight of a thing he can no longer pretend he doesn't understand. Morning briefing passed without incident, which was itself a kind of incident. Grady ran the briefing with his usual competence, but without the particular ease. He usually carried his eye contact distributed slightly wrong, his transitions between agenda items fractionally slower than normal. The whole performance about 2% off in a way that was invisible to most of the room, and entirely visible to someone who had spent 7 years reading it. Callaway caught Grady in the corridor after the briefing fell into step beside him in the casual way of colleagues sharing a hallway, and said conversationally that Grady seemed a little off this morning. Was everything all right? Grady said yes, everything was fine, just a lot on the administrative side this week, and kept walking the answer technically adequate, but delivered with the directional quality of someone who has decided that forward is the only direction they want to travel in this conversation. Callaway let him go. He stood in the corridor for a moment with his hands in his pockets, and his ring hand very still, doing the kind of thinking that doesn't show on a face that has learned to be unrevealing. He turned his attention to Marcus across the morning, and what he found was nothing he could work with. The Riverside files were completely organized, not just completed, but transformed. Every flag resolved, every cross-reference checked, the whole thing done with a thoroughness that would have been impressive from any officer and was from a first-day transfer. Something that didn't fit comfortably into the category of beginner's luck, and was starting to require a different category entirely. The Alderman Street incident report was flawless, community responsive, exactly what the department's public accountability guidelines asked for, and almost never received. He found himself at Simone's desk at 10:30, approaching from the angle that suggested he was passing through rather than stopping. And he said in the tone of someone offering friendly advice to a colleague they are genuinely concerned about. The new transfer was an unknown quantity. People who come in from other departments sometimes have their own agendas. It was worth being careful about who you aligned yourself with before you understood who they actually were and what they were actually here for. Simone listened to the entire thing with the patience of someone who has received this kind of message many times in many configurations and has developed an efficient internal processing system for it. She did not agree. She did not disagree. She said, "I appreciate you saying so," in a register that communicated absolutely nothing beyond the fact that the words had been received, and then she looked back at her screen. Callaway walked away from that desk with the sensation that something he had intended to accomplish had not been accomplished without being able to identify precisely where it had failed. An hour later, Marcus passed Simone's desk on his way to the records corridor. His pace unchanged, his trajectory entirely routine. Without looking up from her keyboard, without altering the rhythm of her typing, Simone slid a folded piece of paper to the edge of the desk closest to his path. Marcus's hand, passing the desk at the same height as the paper, collected it with the same motion as his stride, smooth, unremarkable, and carried it into the corridor. He unfolded it in the records room, read it once, folded it again, and placed it in his jacket pocket. 3 badge numbers, 3 dates, 3 incident report numbers. The specific report she knew from 2 years of close and helpless observation had entered the system as one thing and exited as another. He had 5 of the 7 she'd mentioned yesterday. He now had all 7. The break room at 12:15 was empty except for the coffee maker and Marcus, who poured himself a cup without any particular optimism and drank it standing at the window that looked out at the side yard where a chain-link fence separated the precinct parking from the lot of the insurance office next door, and where nothing was happening that required observation, which made it a useful place to look while thinking. He did not need to write anything down to know what he had. He had been trained in environments where writing things down before the right moment created records, before records were useful, and he had developed the habit of maintaining full mental organization of a situation. A living document updated continuously, arranged by significance rather than chronology that he could translate into written form when the translation was required. The picture was complete now. Not suggestive, not partially assembled, not in the territory of strong suspicion, complete. He could see the beginning of it, which was the specific moment approximately 3 years ago when Callaway had apparently decided that his role in the 9th extended beyond his official function and into the management of the unit's culture in ways the official function didn't authorize. The middle of it, which was the accumulated architecture of manipulated records, disappeared. Complaints, blocked promotions, and quiet institutional pressure that had driven 4 officers out of the unit in 18 months. And the end of it, which was where things were now with the structure exposed and the exposure documented and the documentation secured. Each manipulated file represented a person who had come to Precinct 9 to do a job and had found, instead of a job, a sustained and careful campaign to make them feel that they did not belong here, not through anything dramatic enough to constitute a reportable incident on its own, but through the accumulated weight of 100 small demonstrations that the unit had an owner, and the owner had preferences, and the preferences did not include them. The business owner on Riverside who had filed a complaint that disappeared, she had followed up twice before concluding that the system didn't work for people like her, and stopping. The woman who had been a passenger in the unlawfully searched vehicle, her complaint had never been officially received, which meant, as far as the institution was concerned, it had never existed. 3 of the 4 departed officers had cited variations on the same language in their exit interviews, a feeling that they weren't wanted, that the culture wasn't something they could work within, that it seemed easier to leave. The 4th had said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Marcus opened his personal encrypted device and began writing. Not quickly, not in the pressured way of someone racing against a clock, but with the steady thoroughness of someone converting a complete understanding into a complete document, making sure that each fact cited its specific source, that each pattern named its specific components, that the picture that had assembled itself across 3 days of careful observation was rendered in language that left nothing to inference that could instead be demonstrated. When he finished, he read it once from beginning to end with the same attention he had given the Riverside files, looking for gaps, for ambiguity, for any point where the structure of the argument depended on a connection that wasn't explicitly supported by the evidence cited. He found 2 places where the language was softer than the evidence warranted, and he made it harder. He found one place where a specific file number was missing, and he added it from memory. He sent the document to Marcia's secure address. Subject line 4 words. He closed the device. He stood at the window for another moment, his coffee cooling in his hand, and he thought about the 4 officers whose departures this document now explained, people who had come here and been quietly, methodically driven out before he arrived, who had made the decision that Simone had been making every day for 2 years, and who would never know that the files they had left behind had finally been read by someone who knew what to look for. There was a woman named Officer Dana Reeves in the exit documentation who had left 17 months ago after citing vague discomfort with the unit's culture, who had transferred to a district 45 minutes away and was, according to the personnel notes, performing exceptionally in her new posting. She would not know about this document. She would not know about the next 48 hours. She would simply experience at some undetermined future point the downstream effects of an institution that had begun to correct itself, and would not know why things had changed, only that they had. It was not enough as accountings go, but it was what the evidence made possible, and what the evidence made possible was what Marcus had come here to do. He rinsed his coffee cup, put it on the drying rack with the particular care of someone who does not leave things for other people to take care of, and went back to work. The records corridor at 245 had the quality of a place that is frequently passed through and rarely occupied a transitional space slightly cooler than the main floor, because of the way the ventilation ran, lined with filing cabinets that contained the unit's archived documentation going back 11 years in one direction and the current case management materials in the other. Marcus was pulling a specific archived file, a case from 14 months ago, whose cross-reference had turned up twice in the Riverside documentation, when he heard the footsteps in the corridor, the particular tempo of someone walking with a destination. They are approaching slowly, the way people walk when the destination is a decision, and they are still making it. Teller stopped at the entrance to the records corridor and looked at him. He was holding his gear bag by the strap turned sideways slightly, as if he had not quite committed to turning into the corridor, but had also not committed to continuing past it. His expression was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time, and has reached the particular exhaustion that is the last stage before the carrying becomes impossible. 19 years. Marcus knew the number. He had read Teller's file with the same attention he had given all the files, and the number sat in his understanding of Teller as significant, not because longevity was itself meaningful, but because it meant Teller had been present for all of it. The long, slow accumulation of everything that had built itself inside Precinct 9 and had watched it and had said nothing long enough that silence had become the default setting from which any other choice now required a specific, effortful override. Teller said, There are things in the archived performance reviews that someone with the right clearance might want to look at. He said it looking at Marcus, not at the floor, not at the file cabinet, looking at Marcus directly, which cost him something. Marcus could see that it cost him something. And then he pointed to the second filing cabinet from the left bottom drawer. "There's a section in the back behind the 2021 materials," Teller said. "Someone with access to the unit's records would be within their rights to review what's there." Marcus said, "Thank you, James." The use of the first name was deliberate and genuine, not tactical, not a tool of rapport management, just the acknowledgement that a person deserves when they have done something that costs them something. Teller received it with a small nod, a quick downward tilt of his head, the gesture of someone accepting something they weren't sure they deserved. He turned and walked back down the corridor without looking back, and Marcus watched him go with the understanding of a man who has spent his career in rooms where the most important things are said sideways by people who have not yet decided to be brave, but have decided for a moment to be honest, and who recognizes the difference and knows what it requires. In the bottom drawer behind the 2021 materials was a manila folder containing what were clearly unofficial documents pages of departmental paper, handwritten in the dense script of someone who wrote for their own reference, rather than any audience undated, except for incident-specific references that corresponded to specific cases and specific officers. Notes that Callaway had kept, apparently for his own protection, the private record a man with his history might maintain against the possibility of ever needing to demonstrate a documented rationale for the decisions he'd made about people and paperwork and promotions. It was, Marcus recognized immediately, the most comprehensive piece of evidence in the collection, more damning than the file inconsistencies, more specific than the attachment gaps, because it was in Callaway's own hand and represented his own record of his own thinking, maintained privately and never intended to be read by anyone but himself, which meant it was the version of events he had never felt any need to make presentable. Marcus photographed every page. He replaced the folder exactly as he had found it, closed the drawer quietly, and returned to the main floor with his usual even step. He had everything now. Every piece was in place. The document was already sent. The 48 hours were running. 5:45. The locker room was thinner than usual, 2 officers on extended patrol, one at a community meeting. Teller gone early, the room operating at reduced capacity and feeling it the way spaces feel larger when the people who usually fill them have taken their atmosphere with them. Callaway was there, jacket off the familiar posture at the familiar locker, but the room around him had a different acoustic quality. The laughter that usually formed the soundtrack of this hour was present but not full, not round, not the genuine article. It was the imitation of itself performed by fewer people with less conviction, and it bounced off the metal and tile in a way that emphasized its own insufficiency. Callaway said, "This is how we do things in the 9th. And his shoulders rolled back and his ring hand moved, and he said it with his full usual conviction. But the room that received it was smaller than it used to be, and conviction needs a room of a certain size to echo properly, and this room was no longer quite large enough. Nobody laughed. Pruitt made a sound. Nobody else made a sound. Callaway looked at the wall above his locker for a moment, then continued talking about something else, filling the silence himself, which was a thing he had never needed to do before, and the doing of which he did not fully register as significant, because significance requires contrast, and contrast requires perspective, and perspective was at this particular moment precisely what he lacked. Across town, in a downtown office that stayed lit later than the surrounding ones, Deputy Chief Helen Marsh was reading a document for the second time the number of times she needed to read something before she was confident she understood every implication. The document was 7 pages, single-spaced, cited 34 specific file references, and had arrived in her secure inbox that afternoon with a subject line containing 4 words. She read the last page, set the document down, and looked at the middle distance for a moment, what she did when she had finished processing something difficult and was in the brief interval between processing and responding. Then she picked up the phone and made 3 calls. The calls were brief and specific, the kind that contain instructions rather than discussions made by people who have already done the discussion internally and are now in the execution phase. After the 3rd call, she put the phone down and looked at the document one more time. She reached for a yellow legal pad and wrote a single line at the top 11 times. 18 months. 4 officers. She underlined it once. Then she opened the document again and began preparing for morning. Marcus at home ate dinner alone at a table that was the right size for 1 person. He washed his single dish and his single glass and put them away with the practiced economy of a man who is responsible first and foremost to himself. He set his alarm for 5:30. He laid his uniform over the chair, the way he laid it over the chair every night. Jacket, trousers, the left cuff positioned so that in the morning it would be exactly where he needed it. He sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet, not reflecting, not preparing, just present in the way of a person who has done everything required and is now simply resting before what comes next. He turned off the light. In his office on the other side of the city, Grady sat in the dark for 17 minutes before he turned on his desk lamp, and the pool of light it made was much smaller than the room. And he sat in the light and looked at the files on his desk and thought about all the things he had not said, and about what the difference between a person who says nothing and a person who does something wrong actually amounts to in the end when the accounting is done. He did not come to a satisfying answer. He did not expect to. The morning arrived at Precinct 9 in its usual sequence, the parking lot filling in the order it always filled, the smell of the break room coffee preceding everything else, the way it always did. The overhead lights in the locker room doing their fluorescent work with the steady indifference that had characterized them for 11 years. Everything was its ordinary self. The ordinary self of Precinct 9 on a Thursday morning at 7 o'clock was exactly what it had always been, which was part of what made it the right moment for it to become something else entirely. Callaway was in the middle of a sentence, something about the previous night's patrol. Something about a motorist on the east side delivered in the comfortable rolling cadence of a man resuming a conversation that had only temporarily paused because he had been sleeping when the locker room went quiet, in the particular way it does when something has entered the building that changes the atmospheric pressure of the building itself. Not louder, quieter. The specific quiet of people who have stopped their secondary activity because their primary attention has been redirected by something they cannot yet see. Callaway stopped mid-sentence. The footsteps in the main corridor were not dramatic. Deputy Chief Helen Marsh did not walk dramatically, had no use for the theatrical deployment of pace or presence, understood that real authority is never loud about itself. But the footsteps were accompanied by other footsteps, 2 sets of them, each carrying the quality of people who are there in an official capacity and know it, and the sound of the combination arrived at the locker room door a moment before Marsh herself did. She appeared in the doorway, not stopping, not pausing, moving with the directed efficiency of someone who has prepared for every aspect of the next 2 hours and is now executing the preparation, and behind her were 2 men in the civilian clothes of internal affairs, investigators, and beside them a woman with a case binder and the posture of an HR representative who has participated in consequential conversations many times before and is entirely prepared to do it again. She looked at the room for exactly 1 second, registering its occupants with the completeness of a practiced scan, and then she turned and walked toward Grady's office with the 3 others behind her and did not look back. The locker room watched her go. Callaway stood at his locker with one hand on the door and the other at his side, and the hand at his side was for the first time in 3 days perfectly still. No tapping, no movement. The ring catching the light without making any sound. His shoulders had begun to roll backward with their familiar reflex, and had stopped somewhere in the middle of the motion, not completing, not returning, just arrested in place like a mechanism whose power supply has been interrupted. He looked at the corridor where Marsh had disappeared. He looked at the locker room door. He looked at the window at the far end of the room that faced the main bullpen, through which, in the middle distance, he could see the front entrance and the hallway that led to Grady's office. His ring hand dropped to his side. Pruitt said his name. He did not respond. The morning continued in its ordinary way around the edges of the room because mornings at a precinct continue regardless of what is happening in any specific part of them. Phones rang in the bullpen. A radio crackled in the eastern corridor. The coffee maker completed its cycle, and all of it had the quality of noise happening in a separate room. From the room where the significant thing was occurring, a parallel reality of routine running, alongside the moment in which the routine was ending. Grady's office door was closed. Through the window at the far end of the locker room, you could see nothing specific, just the glass partition of the far office and the light inside it, and the shadows that moved within the light and the quality of stillness that falls over a building when something irreversible has begun inside it. "What is this?" someone said. The voice was young, uncertain. Nobody answered because nobody in the room who understood what this was wanted to say it out loud, and the ones who didn't understand it were waiting for someone else to go first, and no one was going first. And so the question remained in the air of the locker room unanswered, floating above the smell of industrial soap and old coffee, and the specific unease of people who have all at once the sensation of standing on a floor they had believed was solid and are now receiving new information about its composition. Callaway's hand at his side moved once a ghost of the tapping motion and then went still again. He did not say, "This is how we do things in the ninth." He did not say anything at all. Grady's office door opened at 7:23. Marsh came out first, followed by the two investigators. The HR representative a step behind, and the quality of their movement was the quality of people who have completed a specific stage of a process and are proceeding to the next stage with the same purposeful economy they brought to the first. Marsh did not look at the locker room. She walked toward the bullpen and did not look back. Callaway watched through the locker room window as she entered the bullpen. He was standing exactly where he had been standing for the past 23 minutes at his locker, one hand on the door, the other at his side, and he had not moved in any direction because moving required a decision about which direction to move, and no direction had presented itself as clearly correct. The first layer came through the body. His shoulder roll, the motion that had been as automatic as breathing for as long as he could remember the reset function his body performed whenever it needed to reclaim a room, did not complete itself. It started the way it always started, the slow backward rotation of a man who carries his authority in his posture, and then, somewhere in the middle of it, his body received a message that his mind had not yet fully processed, and the motion simply stopped mid-arc, as though the instruction had been rescinded before the motion could finish executing. His hand on the locker door went loose, and then still the door swinging very slightly on its hinge, and the small sound of the hinge was the only sound he made. The color moved through his face in stages, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the terrible gradualness of something draining the blood, pulling back from the surface of his skin. The way water recedes before a wave leaving behind a pallor that was not fear exactly, but was adjacent to fear, the way cold is adjacent to pain. He felt it in his chest first, not a hammering, not a racing, but a sudden awful heaviness, like something that had been suspended for 3 days had just been dropped. The second layer came from memory, and it came all at once. He heard his own voice first. The locker room 2 mornings ago. The comfortable certainty of it. Some people just don't belong here no matter what paper says. And the sound of it in his memory was different from the sound of it in the moment, because in the moment it had been evidence of his power, and in his memory it had become evidence of something else, something assembling itself rapidly and without his permission into a shape he did not want to look at directly. He felt the ghost weight of his ring tapping the locker door in time with those words, felt the echo of the laughter that followed, felt all of it reassemble in the specific sequence of a man watching himself from the outside for the first time with the devastating clarity of a thing that cannot be unseen. Then the briefing room. Give him the Riverside files that'll keep him busy and out of our way. the stack of 18 months of carefully undone documentation handed to a man he had categorized and dismissed before the man had fully walked through the door, handed as an instrument of diminishment, received as an instrument of evidence. Then the workspace, every pass-through, every casual, small put-down delivered to an audience he was performing for the Alderman Street. Call the 1240 confrontation in the workspace with Grady, standing silently to the side. The words, "a different posting," might be a better fit delivered with the breezy confidence of 16 years of impunity. He had handed it all over. He had assembled the evidence himself, piece by piece, across 3 days of treating a man as furniture, and the furniture had been the architect of his destruction from the moment it had walked through the door and read his name off his badge. He felt the specific sickness of it, not the fear of consequence, which was its own thing and would come in its own time, but the prior sickness, the understanding that he had not been outmaneuvered by anything external, that he had been outmaneuvered by his own assumptions, his own certainty, his own inability to imagine that the person he had decided was beneath him was the person who was already above him. The third layer was Marcus. Marcus stepped into the bullpen from the records corridor at 7:26. He had been there since 6:15 doing his work, because that was what he was there to do. And he moved across the room with the same quiet, measured pace he had moved with every morning for 3 days. His uniform pressed his leather folder under his arm, his left cuff straight. He looked up once in the direction of the locker room window before he reached Marsh. The look was brief. It did not linger. It did not contain anger or satisfaction or any of the emotions that a person who has been wronged might reasonably be expected to carry to this moment. It contained only recognition, the specific recognition of a man who has seen what he expected to see and finds it exactly where he expected to find it. And then it was over his gaze, moving on, arriving at Marsh, and he gave a single nod. Marsh nodded back. In the locker room, Callaway felt the look land and pass, and the passing of it was in some ways worse than the landing, because it contained within it the specific information that he had been thought about, accounted for, and moved past, that he was not the conclusion of anything, but simply a fact that had been documented and was now being administered. One item in a sequence of items no more significant to the proceeding than any other. He had spent 16 years being the most significant person in every room at the 9th. He now understood with a completeness that no argument could have produced that he had spent the last 3 days being the least significant person in the most significant room and had not known it, and the not knowing had been the condition that made everything else possible. His ring hand came up slowly without intention, the reflexive motion of a man reaching for something to hold on to, and rested against the locker door. He did not tap it. He simply held it there, the gold catching the fluorescent light, warm and useless. The call to assemble went through the precinct at 7:30 via the PA system. Marsh's voice delivering it in the even, unhurried tones of an instruction that does not require compliance to be enforced, because the people receiving it understand immediately that compliance is not optional. All available personnel to the main briefing room immediately, full unit assembly. People moved. The briefing room filled in the manner of a room filling under the force of something larger than routine, not chaotically, not urgently, but with the particular directed energy of people who know that what is about to happen matters and want to be positioned correctly when it does whatever correctly means in a situation whose shape is still emerging. Chairs were taken without the usual negotiations of habit and preference. Voices dropped naturally, the way voices drop when the room itself has become the kind of room where speaking at full volume feels like the wrong register. Grady took a position near the side wall, not seated, standing slightly apart from the officers around him in the posture of a man who is present because he is required to be present and is managing the requirement with whatever dignity the situation still permitted him. Pruitt found a seat in the middle rows, the middle being the location of someone who is trying to determine which direction is safest before committing to either. She looked at the front of the room and then at her hands and then at the front of the room again. Teller came in near the end, taking a seat at the back row with the calm deliberateness of a man who has had 19 years of practice being at the back of this room and has, in the last 48 hours, arrived at a different relationship with what that position means. He sat straight, which was not his usual posture in these assemblies. He looked at the front of the room and kept looking. Simone took a position near the door, not because she planned to leave, but because the door was where she had learned to stand in rooms like this one where exits were worth knowing. She was still her hands at her sides, and her face carried the expression of someone who has been told to keep their head down for 48 hours and has done it, and is now watching those 48 hours complete themselves. Callaway came in last, or nearly last, and took a position near the second row, in the absence of the certainty that would normally have placed him in the first. He stood rather than sat. His shoulders were back not in the role of dominance, but in the rigid set of a man holding his posture through will rather than ease. He did not look at anyone directly. Marsh stood at the front of the room. She did not use the podium. She stood in the center with the two investigators flanking her at a slight distance, and she waited until the room had fully settled, not long 30 seconds enough to let the silence do its preliminary work. "This department has been conducting an internal personnel review," she said, without preamble, without the warm-up language that briefings usually begin with, just the thing itself delivered directly. "The review is complete. The findings have been submitted to the Office of Professional Standards. Effective immediately, there are changes to the command structure of this unit." She paused, and then she said, "Before I introduce those changes, I'm going to read something into the record." She opened her case binder. The review documentation identifies a specific phrase that appears 11 times across 18 months of unit communications, incident reports, and exit interviews, always in connection with a personnel action targeting a black officer. The phrase is, "Some people just don't belong here no matter what paper says." She looked up from the binder and let the room hold it. "That phrase will appear in this record one final time today as evidence of the culture this unit is leaving behind." The room absorbed this in complete silence. Nobody moved. Callaway's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. He couldn't. Somewhere in the room, a chair shifted barely an inch, and the sound of it was the loudest thing anyone had said in 30 seconds. Marsh closed the binder. "Captain Marcus Webb will address the unit." The title landed, not officer, not transfer, captain. And the silence that followed was the most powerful sound in the room because it was the silence of a room rearranging itself around a truth it had been standing next to for 3 days without knowing it. Callaway's grip on the back of the chair in front of him tightened. Pruitt looked at the floor. Teller at the back let out a breath through his nose, slow, controlled, the sound of a man releasing something he has been holding for 19 years. Simone at the door kept her eyes on Marcus and did not look anywhere else. Marcus stepped to the front of the room. He moved the way he had moved for 3 days, unhurried, measured, with the particular quality of a person who does not need the room's permission to occupy its center, because the center is simply where he is. He faced them. Before he said anything, his right hand moved to his left cuff and straightened it, the small, precise motion performed for himself, not for them, the same ritual it had always been. He looked across the faces in front of him, across all of them deliberately the way a man surveys the full extent of what he is responsible for. And then he straightened very slightly, and the room, without being asked, did the same. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to raise his voice to be heard, and he did not need to begin now. "The review that Deputy Chief Marsh mentioned found a pattern in this unit," he said, and he paused there not for effect, but because what followed required its own space. A pattern in the way personnel decisions were made, in the way complaint documentation was handled, and in the way this unit's culture treated the people who worked in it. That pattern did real damage. Not abstract damage, but damage to specific people, to their careers, to their confidence in this institution, to the community members whose complaints disappeared into a process that was not working for them. He let that sit for a moment. "That ends today." Nobody moved. The room had the particular held quality of people who are listening in the way you listen, when you know that what is being said will still be relevant tomorrow when the listening matters beyond the moment. I am not here to punish this room, Marcus said. I am going to say that clearly because I want you to understand it clearly. The findings from the review will result in specific consequences for specific individuals. Those consequences are being administered separately, and they will reflect what the evidence shows. What happens in this room going forward is not about the past, it is about the standard. He looked across them, across Pruitt, who was looking at him now with the expression of someone in the early stages of reckoning with the cost of their own choices. Across the younger officers who were simply receiving, who had not been part of the pattern, and were now inheriting the correction of it. Across Teller, who was looking at him with something that resembled at this distance and in this light the quiet of a man who has finally set something down. The standard is straightforward, Marcus said. Do the work. Treat every person who walks through that door, officer, civilian, complainant, witness, anyone with the dignity that the badge requires. Let the record speak for itself because the record is what survives all of us. He turned slightly, then not to the whole room, but to Simone specifically in the deliberate, unmistakable way of a person who has decided that some things need to be said in front of witnesses because the witnesses are part of what makes them real. Officer Carver, he said, your promotion review will be reopened under independent evaluation within the week. Your record speaks for itself. It should have been heard a long time ago. Simone held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked forward at the front wall of the briefing room at nothing specific, and something in her face resolved itself quietly, the way a long-sustained tension resolves when the thing that was sustaining it has finally been acknowledged. Then Marcus said without any change in his voice in the same even register he had used for everything else. Some of you heard someone say recently that this is how we do things in the Ninth. A single beat of silence. The room was so still the fluorescent hum was audible. Starting today, that sentence means something different. It means we do things right. It means the record is clean. It means every person in this building, officer and civilian alike, gets treated like their presence matters. Because it does. He looked at Callaway, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the direct level gaze of a man who has completed something he came here to complete, and who wants the person across from him to understand clearly and without ambiguity that the understanding between them is mutual and permanent. We are going to do the work now, Marcus said. And the room adjusted the way a room adjusts when something that should have been true for a long time has finally, without fanfare, become true. The assembly dispersed in the quiet, purposeful manner of people who have received something significant and are moving through the first minutes of integrating it, not slowly, not reluctantly, but with a changed quality of attention, like a room after rain, that smells different from the room before it. Marsh waited until the room had cleared to a skeleton and then moved toward the main hallway, and the first door they stopped at was the one behind which the specific consequence of the morning's evidence would be delivered in its formal terms. They called Callaway in. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and Marcus was not present for it. He was in his office, the one that bore his name now in the provisional form of a printed placard, reviewing the morning's case intake. With the same deliberate attention he gave all his work, going through the process of a man for whom the delivery of a reckoning is not the conclusion of a thing, but simply the point at which one stage ends and the next begins. He heard later the specific sequence of it from Marsh in the brief and factual debrief she provided afterward. The 34 file citations, the badge number pattern across 18 months of manipulated records, the 2 disappeared complaints, the 3 blocked promotions without documented rationale, Callaway's unofficial notes, his own hand, his own paper, his own careful record of decisions he had apparently felt the need to document for himself, read against the formal record in sequence the version of events he had never intended anyone to read, sitting alongside the version he had constructed for the institution to see. He had not argued. At one point he had asked about the union, and the question had received the answer that questions of that kind receive. When the evidence is what this evidence was, The union had been notified of the findings and had declined to contest the formal separation process. He was pulled from active duty pending formal separation review. He was instructed to surrender his badge and service weapon. The surrender took place at the records desk in the main corridor, not in a closed office, not in a room where only the participants were present, but at the desk that was visible through the glass partition from the main bullpen, where the morning's work was continuing, where officers were moving between their desks and the intake counter and the filing area, and where the sight of a 16-year veteran surrendering his shield was visible to anyone who looked in the right direction at the right moment. Several people did. The badge made a small flat sound when it touched the counter. Callaway's ring hand, which had tapped and rolled and marked time through every encounter of the past 3 days, rested flat on the surface next to it and then pulled slowly away, and the gold caught the corridor light one last time as his hand withdrew. He walked out of the building through the main corridor without speaking to anyone, and nobody spoke to him, and the morning went on around the fact of his leaving, the way mornings go on around the fact of all departures, by continuing, by not stopping by, proceeding to the next thing. Grady's conversation was different in tone and in conclusion. Marsh was direct with him in a different way, not the way you are direct with someone about what they have done, but the way you are direct with someone about what they have chosen not to do, which is its own category of accountability and requires its own specific language. Grady had been the unit's supervisor for 7 years. He had known enough, or had been in the position of someone who could have known if he had chosen to look. He had not looked. That was not criminal in the way Callaway's actions were criminal, but it was consequential in the way that enabling always is. He was formally reprimanded. He was reduced from sergeant to officer effective immediately. He was placed on a structured performance plan under Marcus's direct supervision. The terms were not negotiable, and Grady did not negotiate them. He said at the end of the conversation, "I should have said something." He said it plainly, without decoration, without any bid for mitigation. Just the acknowledgement offered into the room in the way of a man who has decided that the minimum he owes the moment is honesty. Marsh said yes, and then the conversation was over. Pruitt remained on the unit. She received no formal action. She had not manipulated records, had not blocked promotions, had not done any of the specific things the evidence addressed. What she had done was laugh at the right moments and stay close to the person who set the room's temperature, and that was not a documentable offense, but was its own kind of record, and she would carry it forward in the specific way that people carry things that have no external consequence but are present in the body nonetheless. In the afternoon, the formal case documentation was processed and entered into the official record. Every photograph, every file citation, every page from Teller's drawer, the full document that Marcus had sent to Marsh's secure address 2 days prior. The chain of custody was clean and complete. 1 week later, the precinct was the same building it had always been. Same floors, same lights, same coffee operating at the same ambiguous level of quality. The physical facts of Precinct 9 had not changed. What had changed was the feeling of standing inside those physical facts, which is a different kind of change, and in the long run the more significant one. Marcus ran the morning briefing at 7, and it was a briefing in the way all briefings at Precinct 9 had always been: assignments, case updates, administrative notes, but the room in which it was happening had a different quality of attention, a different relationship to the person at the front of it. Not deferent in the old performance-based way, not the attention of people managing their relationship with a power structure they don't control, but the more honest attention of people who are genuinely listening because they have reason to believe what they hear will be straight. He called each officer by rank and name, not casually, not with the brand of familiarity that collapses hierarchy into a social club, but with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. Each name said as though it meant what it actually meant. Simone functioned as acting senior officer during the transition period, which everyone in the room understood was not a temporary status in any meaningful sense, but a formality that the administrative timeline had not yet caught up with. She ran the intake desk in the morning and the case review process in the afternoon with the efficiency of someone who has been doing the work of their actual role for a long time and is finally being seen doing it. The competence already there, only the official acknowledgement newly present. Her posture in the room was different, and she would have said, if asked, that nothing about her had changed. She was doing what she had always done in the way she had always done it. And she would have been right, except that she was doing it without the constant low-level physical effort of a person who is braced for the floor to shift, without the background calculation of someone who has learned that the environment has forces operating in it that are not interested in their success. The ease was not new. The conditions that allowed the ease to be visible were new. Teller did his work. He had always done his work. The work had never been in question. He did it now the way he had always done it, except that the silence he carried was different in texture. The way silence changes when it is no longer protecting something that needed to be protected and is simply the preference of a man who has said what he needed to say and is now at peace with the amount he said. Pruitt came in, did her job, and left at the end of her shift, and she did this every day of the first week with a consistency that was in its own way a kind of accounting. The accounting of someone who has understood clearly and without the need for it to be stated that what follows is a record, and that the record is what she has to offer now. The room was not transformed. It was not the version of itself that it would eventually become. That version requires time and the accumulation of new experiences in new conditions, the slow replacement of old patterns with new ones, the gradual building of a trust that cannot be declared but only demonstrated. None of that had happened yet fully, but the rot had been removed, which is the precondition for everything that follows, and the room breathed differently in its absence, not freely, yet not without the memory of what had been there, but with a quality of possibility that had not been present 1 week ago. At the end of the first week's last briefing, when the officers were filing out, Marcus stood at the front and watched them go with the particular attention of someone taking an inventory, not of the problems, but of the people, the individuals who were the unit, and who would do the actual daily work of becoming what the unit was capable of being. He stayed late on this Friday of the first full week, not because the work required it, but because the work had a rhythm, and the rhythm had a natural endpoint that was a little later than the official end of the shift. The captain's office was the same room it had always been, same desk, same window, same overhead light that was adequate without being kind. Marcus had moved nothing except to place his leather folder and his personal notebook on the left side of the desk in the particular arrangement that worked for the way he worked. He went through the week's reports, each one clean, each one filed with the completeness and the professional care that the week's first briefing had made a standard rather than an aspiration. No flags, no inconsistencies, no gaps in the attachment sequences. He opened the bottom drawer of the desk when he reached the last report. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He had gone through the desk's contents on his first day as a matter of course. But the bottom drawer, pulled further than he had pulled it that first time, revealed a manila envelope resting against the back panel behind the ordinary detritus of the previous occupant's administrative materials. Inside the envelope was a piece of paper, handwritten on departmental letterhead, a list of 5 names. He read them one by one. Beneath each name in smaller writing, a date, the date of the transfer request, and a case number, the personnel case number attached to the departure. And next to 3 of the names in ink, slightly different from the surrounding notation. 2 initials B. C. Brett Callaway. He did not photograph the list. He did not forward it, not because it was not relevant, but because it was not evidence in the legal sense, not a document that changed the outcome of anything that was already decided. It was something else. It was a record of the people who had come before the outcome, who had absorbed what the unit had been before anyone dismantled it, who had made the decision that Simone had been making every day, and had decided finally that they couldn't sustain it. He sat with the list for a time. He thought about what it costs a person to leave a place they came to believing it would allow them to do their job. He thought about the specific calculation of that decision the morning you decide that the thing you are sustaining is heavier than what you are sustaining it for the specific form of grief that comes with leaving a place you had no intention of leaving when you arrived. One of the names on the list was a woman named Officer Dana Reeves. She had left 17 months ago after citing vague discomfort with the unit's culture and had transferred to a district 45 minutes away and was, according to the personnel notes, performing exceptionally in her new posting. She would not know about this document. She would not know about the last 3 days. She would simply experience at some undetermined future point the downstream effects of an institution that had begun to correct itself and would not know why things had changed, only that they had. He folded the list and placed it in his own folder in the section behind the case materials where it would stay. Not as evidence, not as a grievance, as a reminder of the reason the work was worth doing, as the record of the cost of the thing he had come here to correct. He closed the folder. His right hand moved to his left cuff and straightened it at the edge of the desk, the private version of the gesture, the one that was purely for himself. The small ritual of a man who has learned that the way you carry yourself in a room where no one is watching is the truest version of the way you carry yourself in rooms where everyone is. He held the cuff for a moment, fingers flat against the fabric, and then let go. He turned off the desk light and walked through the quiet building to the parking lot, and the night was still, and the precinct lights glowed behind him, and ahead of him the city went about its enormous ordinary business, indifferent and alive. The letter arrived on a Tuesday official departmental correspondence. Her name printed on the envelope in the clean font of the personnel office, addressed through the internal mail system in the ordinary way of things that are, despite their significance, processed through the same pipeline as expense reports and policy updates. She picked it up from her inbox tray at 12:07 during the quiet interval between the morning push and the afternoon case reviews, when the bullpen was down to its reduced lunch complement and the particular quality of the room was different, more spacious acoustically, the way rooms feel different when the people who usually occupy them are temporarily absent. She looked at the return address in the upper left corner, the personnel office. She turned the envelope over, ran her thumb along the sealed flap, and opened it in the manner of someone who has been waiting for a letter they are not entirely certain has been sent, approaching the fact of it in its envelope with a certain careful attention, not wanting to assume before the assumption has been confirmed. The letter was brief. Official language, clean and direct. The kind of prose that the personnel office produces in its formal capacities, precise, stripped of anything that might be construed as warmth or its absence. She read it once from salutation to closing, and then read it again, not because she had missed anything the first time, but because some things deserve to be read twice the second time. Not for the information, but for the fact of the information, for the physical experience of the words sitting on the page while you are looking at them. Her promotion to the rank of sergeant had been approved effective the following Monday. The evaluation had been conducted under independent review, as indicated in the personnel case file, and the result of the review was consistent with the documented record of her performance over the preceding period of service. She was invited to contact the personnel office at her convenience regarding the administrative details of the transition. She thought about the first promotion review 26 months ago. The delays, the excuses, the way Grady's voice had sounded when he told her she needed more time, the specific quality of his eye contact during that conversation, which was the eye contact of a man who knows he is delivering something that isn't true and has decided to deliver it anyway, because the alternative requires something of him he is not prepared to give. She thought about sitting at her desk afterward, alone at lunch, doing the math on how long she would be able to keep doing this before the math stopped working. She thought about the parking lot conversation, keep your head down for 48 hours, and the specific quality of Marcus's voice when he said it, which was not the voice of someone offering comfort, but the voice of someone with a plan, and how she had understood the difference and had kept her head down and had not regretted it for a single hour of the 48. She folded the letter along its original fold lines. She placed it back in its envelope. She put the envelope in her bag in the inner pocket and pressed the flap closed. She did not call anyone. She returned to the case review she had been working on before the mail came, and the afternoon continued. Later it was 4:20, the afternoon light coming through the east windows in the long, slanted way it came through in late autumn. At this hour she stopped at Marcus's office doorway. The door was open. He was on the phone, leaning back in the chair, with his eyes on the ceiling in the way of someone who is listening rather than speaking. He saw her in the doorway and held up a single finger. When he hung up, she said, "Monday." Just the word. No context, no explanation. Because the context was understood, and the explanation was not required, and the word itself was enough. He nodded once. She turned and walked back to her desk, and she moved through the bullpen in the way she had always moved through it, with the same competence and the same composure that had been her daily equipment for 2 years. Except that something in the set of her was different now, in the way that things are different when you have stopped waiting for a floor to give way beneath you and the floor has held. She sat down. She did not look over her shoulder. The lawyer's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with the particular impersonal elegance of spaces designed to be neutral, to carry no associations, to provide a background against which difficult conversations can occur without the background contributing anything to them. The view from the window was a parking lot, and beyond it the upper floors of a mid-rise that blocked the view of anything more interesting. Nobody looked at it for pleasure. Callaway sat in the chair across the desk from his attorney, who was explaining in the specific terminology of civil liability what the downstream implications of the departmental findings were likely to be, and the picture being drawn for him was not a picture he had expected to be sitting across from 3 weeks ago, when the biggest problem in his professional life had been a new transfer he had assigned to the Riverside files. The formal separation from the department had been processed without event. His name removed from the duty roster, his locker cleared by HR in his absence, the physical infrastructure of his 16 years in the 9th dissolved with the same unremarkable efficiency that the institution applied to all its administrative necessities. The room had absorbed his absence, the way rooms absorb all absence, by not stopping by, continuing to be a room. His attorney was now explaining the second chapter, which was substantially worse than the first. The civil rights complaint filed on behalf of 3 former officers, whose departure the evidence had now documented, was not a preliminary matter. It was moving forward with the active support of the department's Office of Professional Standards, which had determined that the documented manipulation of personnel records over 18 months constituted a deliberate and provable pattern of discriminatory employment practices. The term the attorney used carefully was personal liability, and she used it in conjunction with the word pension, and then she used both of those words in conjunction with the words federal civil rights statutes. Callaway looked at the parking lot through the window. He was not looking for anything in it. He had spent 16 years building something inside Precinct 9. Not a career exactly. A career is built on what you contribute, and the accounting of what he had contributed was not, in light of the complete picture, a favorable one. What he had built was a position, a set of relationships, a structure of advantage that had functioned as long as it functioned, and had then been dismantled in 48 hours by a man he had dismissed as irrelevant before the man had finished crossing the threshold. He still did not understand even now how it had happened so cleanly. He could not see the specific failure the moment when he had provided the evidence himself, when his own dismissal had been the mechanism of his destruction, when the thing he had handed over as an instrument of diminishment had been received as an instrument of accountability. He could not see it because seeing it required understanding that he had been wrong from the first moment, wrong about who Marcus was, wrong about what the files contained, wrong about what his 16 years had built. And that kind of understanding requires a quality of honest self-examination that had never been among his practiced skills. He looked at his hand resting on the arm of the chair. The gold wedding band was still there, warm against his finger, unchanged. It was not tapping anything. His attorney continued speaking. Callaway looked at the parking lot and said nothing, and the afternoon moved through the window at its usual pace, and somewhere across the city, Precinct 9 was going about the business of becoming a different version of itself, and he was not part of it and would not be. The federal courthouse on Millard Street was a different kind of building from Precinct 9, taller, more deliberate in its architecture, with the particular gravity of a structure that was designed to communicate before anyone said a word inside it, that what happened within its walls was permanent. Marble floors, high ceilings, the sound of footsteps arriving before the person making them did. The civil rights trial of the former officers whose careers Callaway had dismantled 3 of them, whose names had been on the list in Marcus's personnel file, whose departure records now formed the spine of a federal complaint, had been assigned to Judge Patricia Okafor, a woman who had spent 22 years on the federal bench and had developed over those years a specific and well-documented intolerance for the particular category of harm that wears institutional clothing. Callaway sat at the defendant's table in a suit he had bought for the purpose, dark navy, well-fitted, an attempt to restore through clothing the authority that had been removed through record, and he looked like a man who is performing composure rather than possessing it, which is a distinction that is immediately visible to anyone who has seen both. He had lost weight in the months since the formal separation. His face was thinner. The confidence that had once been as automatic as his shoulder roll was nowhere visible, replaced by the particular watchfulness of a person who has learned recently and at great cost that rooms contain things they did not previously know to look for. The 3 plaintiffs sat in the front row of the gallery, Officers Dana Reeves, Marcus Elliott, and James Faraday, each of them having traveled back to a city they had left under the understanding that leaving was the only option available to them. Each of them now understanding that leaving had been the option presented to them by someone who had rigged the environment to make all other options feel impossible. They did not look at Callaway. They looked at the front of the courtroom with the patient attention of people who have been waiting a long time for a room in which their account of events would be the operative account. Dana Reeves was the first plaintiff to take the stand. She was 41 now, and she had been at the 9th for 3 years before the accumulation of unexplained assignment changes, blocked evaluations, and the specific experience of sitting across from Grady and being told that she needed more time to demonstrate leadership readiness had finally become heavier than her commitment to staying, and she had transferred. She had built an excellent record at her new posting. She had been promoted to sergeant 14 months after leaving the 9th. She was by any measurable standard a person who had possessed everything the 9th's evaluation process had told her she lacked. She said this on the stand calmly, with the particular composure of someone who has had a long time to organize their experience into language. She described the specific incidents that had shaped her departure, not with anger, not with the performance of injury, but with the flat, factual precision of someone who has learned that the most powerful testimony is the testimony that does not need to ask the listener to feel anything, because the facts properly presented do the feeling on their own. The plaintiff's attorney then played a recording. It was a short audio clip captured from the precinct's internal communication system during a promotion board review, 14 months before Dana Reeves's departure. Callaway's voice clear and unhurried, speaking to an off-camera participant. "She's competent enough, sure, but you know how it is. Some people just don't belong here, no matter what paper says." The courtroom was very quiet when the recording ended. Callaway's attorney objected, citing the recording's chain of custody. Judge Okafor overruled, citing the federal warrant under which the internal communications had been retrieved, the same class of warrant that had secured the Riverside documentation 6 months prior. She looked at the defense table with the expression of a woman who has been on this bench for 22 years and has heard this objection in precisely this context before, and whose patience for it has not increased with time. Callaway looked at the table. He did not look at the front row. He did not look at Dana Reeves, who was looking at him with the steady, unblinking attention of a person who has waited 17 months for a room in which what happened to her would be spoken aloud and acknowledged by an institution capable of acting on it. He looked at the table, and he held very still, and his ring hand flat on the surface in front of him did not move. Judge Okafor delivered her ruling from the bench on a Friday morning, which had the effect of making the courthouse feel like a different kind of building than it did on other mornings. Fuller, more charged, the usual institutional hum replaced by something quieter and more deliberate, the specific atmosphere of a room that knows it is about to say something that cannot be unsaid. The gallery was full. Dana Reeves and Marcus Elliott and James Faraday sat in the front row with their attorneys, their posture carrying the controlled stillness of people who have prepared themselves for both possible outcomes and are now waiting to learn which preparation they needed. Callaway sat at the defendant's table and looked at his hands. Judge Okafor began by summarizing the findings of fact, the specific pattern of personnel manipulation documented across 18 months, the badge number appearing with statistical improbability across every adverse personnel action taken against a black officer in the unit. During that period, the disappeared complaints, the blocked promotions, the unofficial notes written in Callaway's own hand that described officers in terms that no legitimate evaluation process would have recognized as professional criteria. She spoke for 22 minutes. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Then she reached the judgment. "Mr. Callaway," she said, and she paused before his name in the specific way of judges who want the person they are addressing to understand that what follows has been weighed carefully and will be delivered precisely. "You served for 16 years in a position of public trust. The evidence in this case establishes that you used that position over an extended period to deny 3 people, and by the pattern of the record, likely others the professional opportunities they had earned, the fair evaluation they were entitled to, and the basic dignity of being judged on their work rather than on who you had decided they were before they had the chance to show you." She looked at the 3 plaintiffs in the front row. Then she looked back at the defendant's table. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts. Mr. Callaway is found liable for deliberate discriminatory employment practices under federal civil rights law. He is ordered to pay compensatory damages in the amount of $140,000, $46,000 to Officer Reeves, $52,000 to Officer Elliott, and $42,000 to Officer Faraday, representing the calculated difference in salary pension contributions and professional advancement opportunities lost as a direct result of his documented actions." She let that sit for a moment. Then, "Additionally, the court hereby orders the forfeiture of Mr. Callaway's municipal pension effective immediately on the grounds that the conduct for which he is found liable occurred during his period of employment and constitutes a fundamental breach of the terms under which that pension was accrued. The forfeited funds will be directed to a Departmental Equity and Accountability Fund to be administered by the Office of Professional Standards." A sound moved through the gallery, not a gasp, not applause, just the collective exhalation of people who have been holding something in and have been given permission to set it down. Callaway did not move. His attorney placed a hand briefly on his arm. He did not acknowledge it. He was looking at the front of the courtroom with the expression of a man who has arrived finally at the specific destination that the choices of the last several years had been pointed toward all along, and who is experiencing for perhaps the first time the complete and unambiguous understanding of the route that got him here. In the front row, Dana Reeves put her hands flat on her knees, and the gesture was small and precise and unremarkable to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But it was the gesture of a person placing something down the specific physical expression of a weight being set on a surface after a very long time of carrying it. She did not look at Callaway. She looked at the bench at Judge Okafor, and then she looked at Marcus Elliott and James Faraday beside her, and something passed between the 3 of them that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, but lived somewhere in the clean, solid territory between the 2. The gavel came down. The sound of it echoed off the marble floors and the high ceilings, and then was absorbed into the particular quiet that follows finality, the quiet of a room in which something has been said that will not need to be said again, because it has been said correctly once in the right place by the right institution in front of witnesses. It was over. The formal paperwork that removed Brett Callaway's name from the Precinct 9 duty roster was processed on a Wednesday, and the space his name had occupied on the assignment board was filled the following morning with other text. A different name, and the board continued its ordinary work of organizing the present without reference to what it had previously held. His locker was reassigned within the week. The room absorbed his absence the way rooms absorb all absence, by not stopping, by continuing, by moving into the next shift with the same fluorescent hum and the same worn tile and the same coffee that had never been good and would never be good and was nonetheless every morning exactly what the morning required. Somewhere across the city, Dana Reeves sat at her desk in her new district and opened the letter from the court's administrator confirming the compensatory payment, and she read it once, folded it, and put it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered. And then she went back to the case file she had been working on, because that was what she had come here to do, and it was after a very long time of being told otherwise exactly where she was supposed to be. On a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Marcus Webb had walked into a locker room where a man had said that some people just don't belong here, no matter what paper says a young black officer transferred into Precinct 9 for his first assignment. He came through the front door at 7:02, carrying nothing but a folder and the particular alertness of someone entering a room for the first time and trying to read it accurately, and he found the briefing room and took a seat near the back. The first person to acknowledge him was Marcus, who said his name correctly. Said it the first time, the way you say the name of someone whose name matters. Shook his hand and handed him his first assignment directly, without pause, without performance, in the ordinary way of a commanding officer meeting the person he is responsible for and beginning the business of that responsibility immediately, which is to say, with the full uncomplicated fact of his welcome. The young officer sat down, opened his folder, set it on the desk in front of him, and felt something he would not have been able to name in the moment, but that would stay with him for a long time. The rare sustaining feeling of being in a room where you were expected before you arrived, where your presence required no negotiation, where the floor beneath you was exactly as solid as it appeared to be. If this story moved you, if you've ever walked into a room where someone had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, dignity, and the people who refuse to be moved.